Welcome to Your Bird Story, a podcast about everyday people and their relationships and interactions with wild birds. I'm your host, Georgia Silvera Seamans. I am going to be in conversation with biologist and author Joan Strassmann today. We'll be talking about her newest book, The Social Life of Birds. Joan, welcome.
Thank you.
For folks who are not familiar with your work, can you briefly tell us what other books you have written?
I'm an evolutionary biologist and I work on microbes, but I like to write about birds because they're more accessible. My first book was called Slow Birding, and it had the idea that instead of running all over the world to look for birds, we can just enjoy the ones close at home. And so I focused that book on 16 very common birds that were within 20 miles of my St. Louis home and are actually common throughout much of the U.S. My second book was simply a takeoff on the first one where I expanded the activities that someone might want to do and just simply have prompts for things that anybody could go outside and do themselves, kind of like a journal.
I've heard very many good things about Slow Birding, and it is a book that's on my to-read list.
Thank you.
Okay, so I got into this book immediately because of that opening scene that you set up so well. It's super evocative and just really speaks to the lives of birds. And I wonder if you could describe that scene for listeners and talk about why you chose this vignette to open the book.
Northern flickers are one of my favorite birds because they're common throughout much of the country and they're noisy. And the bird that I saw on the morning that I start the book with was simply banging and banging and banging on a metal chimney and calling to its mate, advertising that maybe it had a great nest site, not in the chimney, of course, but nearby, and the chimney formed a way of communicating. The other thing I like about flickers is they're a big bird, but they eat tiny ants. And it's just so amazing to see this huge bird on the ground picking ants out of the cracks in the sidewalk. I just love flickers, and I wrote about them in Slow Birding, and I decided I would also start this book with them.
For folks who aren't familiar with northern flickers, I find that when I tell them that these birds can be found on the ground eating ants, they're often really surprised that a woodpecker engages in this particular kind of behavior. It's really great to have these facts about birds that are surprising for other folks or sort of disrupts their expectations for what birds, different kinds of birds should be doing.
Flickers aren't the only ones that eat ants. The huge pileated woodpeckers, probably our biggest woodpecker in the U.S. that I can think of, they also eat tons of ants. They tend to drill ants out of trees, the big carpenter ants. But there's a lot of things birds do that are really kind of surprising.
And lots of those surprises are contained in this book. And why did you want to write this particular story about birds?
So that's an easy question to answer because ever since I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan and came under the influence of my advisor who met with me all the time, I was interested in social behavior. I myself have studied social behavior in wasps and in microbes, but for teaching, birds work a little better. After my first book of Slow Birding, this just seemed like the obvious next book for me to write, and I had a ton of fun writing it.
Could you describe one of the most fun parts of writing this book, whether that's the actual act of writing or a particular bird or social behavior?
The book was really fun to work on. The writing is in some ways the hardest part. The most fun parts are reading all the articles and learning about the behaviors of the birds. And then also talking with the scientists who have done all the work and were so generous with their stories about what the birds do and how they figured it out.
Do you have a favorite bird of all the birds that you've included in this book?
I suppose everyone I talk to, I'll pick a different favorite bird. I think one of the most stunning images is of the barn swallows in Africa and Nigeria that are spending our winter in the tropics, and they form these roosts of thousands or millions of birds, and the predators know that they're there, and so the bursts just fly down like a tornado of birds to get from being in the air to being in the roost as quickly as possible. And that just seems like such an amazing thing to see. I just love learning about that.
Yeah, I think earlier on in the book you talk about one of the aspects of social behaviors being this attention to geometry and how in murmurations and flight, geometry becomes really important to birds.
Yes, it's sort of that old trope about how fast you have to run from a lion is just enough faster than your friend. So birds kind of do that too, where they want to have safety in numbers and put someone else between them and a potential predator.
Yeah. I chuckled a little bit throughout the book. I would love to take this book as a course. I can imagine that your students are very lucky because the way you communicate science makes it fun, appealing, interesting. And I found that there was humor in your writing, which I really appreciated, some of which shows up in descriptions of the way that birds center themselves in the center, or birds that are consigned to the edge, or even in some of the mating scenarios in the leks, the way that you describe the way that the males behave and female choice. I found myself chuckling at some of those descriptions.
Learning has to be fun, and it should be fun. The birds make it easy for us to connect with that. Yeah, we scientists need to kind of escape from the kind of dry writing that we think science ought to have and tell the stories. I mean, we humans are a storytelling species. Let's put it more in that vein.
Yeah. So the book is not only excellent science communication, but another reason that it's quite easy to read is because of the book's organization. And it's organized by the social behaviors of the birds. That is the focus of the book. But you talk about flocks, roosts, mixed foraging groups, colonies, leks, etc. And I'm curious how you decided to arrange these, starting with flocks and sort of going through to the final.
I struggled with how to organize it. The book basically has two halves, where the first half is all groups where everyone should benefit because you're not helping relatives. And then the second half is more that you may be taking care of your own young, where of course your genes benefit through them. So the second half is helping copies of your genes in other people, other birds, so to speak. I don't know. It just seemed, when I thought about it, to be kind of a logical progression. And I wanted to start with flocks because I felt like, of all the kinds of groups that there might be, the flocks is the one that people will see first themselves. So I'm always thinking about connecting to my audience and what they might be seeing, and then sort of expanding it from there. So I felt like it just made sense for me.
Yeah, with the colonies, the numbers that you cite in the book are sort of staggering. The sheer number of birds that gather together in sea colonies. Intellectually, I know that there are many, many birds globally, but to think about the number of birds in a single colony, I think I was really struck by the numbers that you provided in the book. It's really exciting to think about the sort of numerous nature of bird life in different places, even as we are hearing about bird decline.
The sea colonies, the northern gannets and puffins, and all just nesting on sea cliffs. And then, of course, we do all know about the huge penguin colonies in the Antarctic oceans. They are threatened, and they are, in many places, they are declining, and that's a sort of huge challenge for us. I haven't seen the northern or the southern huge colonies myself. Now this book is written, I just need to go do that.
Yeah. Is there a species that didn't make it into the book for some reason? You cover so many birds. Are there ones that didn't make it and why?
There's lots of birds that didn't make it into the book. Well, first of all, I decided not to really talk about the birds that were in slow birding. Little overlap, but I didn't talk in detail about them. The thing that I really wanted with the birds that I talked about was to talk about birds that the scientists had worked on. So I really wanted birds that, had some great stories behind them. So then there's other birds. I talked about the superb fairy wren. There's lots of other fairy wrens that I didn't talk about that are also super cool. I tried to talk about things that I could figure out and also leave a few birds for my next book.
Do you have a sort of standout species or socializing from the stories you've included? Are there one or two that have really stayed with you?
I really love all of them. I'm just finished with narrating the book for the Audible version. As I read through it, I just thought oh, I really love this one, or I love that one. So one of the last birds in the book is one that I call super social, which is the sociable weaver. That bird lives in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, and it builds these huge thatches in camel thorn and other trees, and the thatch can weigh like a ton. And the birds spend a ton of time adding sticks to it and caring for it. But each nest is just a chamber that will have two parents and maybe a couple of helpers. So they've kind of got two levels of sociality. And one of the things that's really cool about them is that the nests are so big that they really change the ecology of the region. And so that underneath the nests, there's more bird droppings, and that nourishes the plants so they grow better. And then other animals, from birds to even genets, which is a small cat-like predator, will come and use those huge nests as their home. I was in southern France for sabbatical this spring and was fortunate to meet with one of the researchers, Mathieu Paquet. The researchers described these really venomous snakes, cobras and boomslangs, and that they had to watch out for them. But then also, when one of those snakes got in the tree, it would just kill all the birds. So whatever else the researchers were trying to study would just fail. So what Mathieu figured out was that he could wrap the trunk of the tree in that thin plastic that you might see at the airport where they might want to wrap your suitcase in. So he wrapped the trunks of the trees in this plastic, which was too slippery for the snakes to then climb up into the tree. Thought that was pretty amazing.
That is amazing. And I think my question for the researchers is how often does that happen in the course of a study that one would intervene to prevent predation in order to complete the study?
So, if you were studying predation, of course, you wouldn't be able to do that kind of intervention. But if you're trying to understand whether nests with helpers produce more babies than nests without, and a snake comes in and just eats everyone, it just kind of means you can't answer the question. So the researchers are studying just a minority of all the trees. And so they wrap the trees that they're studying and not the others. So, yeah, you're right that researchers have to worry about their impact on what's going on.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I haven't conducted this kind of field research, so it's interesting to think about the constraints that researchers face and I suppose, the clever tactics that they use to ensure that they can collect the data that they need.
Right. Yeah. You asked for another story, and I'll give you one other. This one really touched me. It's the Taiwan Yuhina. And this is a little songbird that has this unusual behavior of multiple pairs laying in the same nest and taking care of the young. And whenever that happens, there's a lot of squabbling about who does the caring and who does the laying and when. And of course, they all want to lay. And then once they've laid, they all care to an extent. And these were worked on in Taiwan. And what they found, the nests are at high altitude and it's often cold and rainy. And what they found was that when it was cold and rainy, the birds fought less over egg laying, and they ended up actually producing more young than when the weather was nice. And so what that showed was that the fighting was worse for the birds than the bad weather. So I just thought that was kind of amazing.
That is very interesting. I think of in human societies how people often get agitated when it's very hot outside. There seems to be a lot more sort of squabbling between people. Even in a family, you go out and it's really hot and everyone's tempers are so much shorter than if the weather was cool.
Yeah. But, maybe humans really come together when there's a true threat. So I remember one of my students talking about living in North Dakota along a river that was flooding and how then everybody started filling the sandbags and helping. And that level of camaraderie really made an impact on him.
That's sort of a good segue to think about any lessons for people that you came across during writing this book, reading all of these research papers and talking to scientists?
I mean, in some ways, the biggest lesson is that watching birds can really enrich our own lives. It's just a wonderful thing to get outside of yourself and watch the birds. And that as we do so, I think it's also really important to remember that the birds need habitat, and habitat all over the world is under threat. And think about conservation when you're thinking about what you might do, how you might vote, all of those things. We need the birds and the birds need us.
Yeah, that sounds like a very strong set of points that you want people to take from this book. Did you think about what you just said? Was this in any way influential when you were thinking about writing the book?
Yes, it was. I mean, I could have written a straight conservation book and mentioned that we've lost 1 billion birds since I was an undergraduate, and written a lot about all of the threats that birds have. And I think such writing is really important to know about. But I wanted to come at it from a sort of gentler perspective, that maybe if you can help people to really nurture their love of birds, that they will do the right thing more naturally than if I had focused on the very real doom and gloom side of conservation in America and in the world.
I know some of the really dire news about the natural world feels almost overwhelming. Like you can't imagine how you as an individual could act to make an impact. And I found that reading this book, while I did have in the back of my mind the real stressors that birds are facing, it also sort of provided ways to think about a possible future for birds, right? Because it seems that there's so very many people who are invested in learning about these species and the places that they live. So there are champions for birds. They're not just sort of out there on their own, that people in fact do really care.
People do care about birds, and birds are the living descendants of dinosaurs. So they've been around for a long time. And I really hope that we can keep as many of them as possible and let our children's children also enjoy the birds.
Joan, it's been really great talking with you. I wish you all the best with your latest book, and I really encourage folks to read it. I can't wait to see the completed version. I have an early copy, and there are probably not too many changes from the copy I have, but wishing you all the best with this one.
Thank you. It's been a delight to speak with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Bird Story. Like, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Your Bird Story is an initiative of Local Nature Lab.